What if one small change in your snack routine could protect your heart, brain, and bones as you age? Most people over 65 are eating nuts thinking they're healthy, but a few hidden choices could be sabotaging your health silently. Stay with me, because the last nut we'll expose might already be in your pantry, and it could be quietly damaging your health. If you're over 65, what you snack on could be silently shaping how well you age. In other words, a handful of the right nuts may lower your risk of heart disease, memory loss, and brittle bones. In other words, but the wrong ones, they can trigger inflammation, raise blood pressure, and quietly undo your progress. In other words, a major Harvard study found that older adults who ate the right nuts had a 20% lower risk of death from all causes. But not all nuts are created equal. In other words, some support brain clarity, joint mobility, and steady blood sugar. In other words, others are packed with oxidized oils, salt, and hidden sugars that strain your heart, liver, and kidneys. In other words, and many people over 60 are eating the wrong ones daily, thinking they're doing something healthy. In other words, in this video, we'll break it down clearly. The 4 best nuts to eat daily after 65 and why they work. In other words, the 4 worst nuts that can harm your circulation, blood sugar, and bones. In other words, let's start with the ones that keep you mobile, sharp, and independent for years to come. In other words, and stay with me, because the last bad nut we'll reveal is in nearly every senior's pantry. Part 1. 4 nuts you should eat daily. In other words, 1. Almonds. In other words, gentle on blood sugar, powerful for heart health. In other words, almonds aren't flashy. In other words, they don't have a trendy reputation, but they might just be one of the most quietly powerful foods a senior can eat every day. In other words, just a small handful delivers a potent mix of magnesium, which relaxes blood vessels and helps lower blood pressure, and vitamin E, a powerful antioxidant that supports brain and skin health. Almonds also contain soluble fiber, which improves gut health and lowers LDL cholesterol, the type that clogs arteries silently over time. In other words, what makes almonds special for older adults is their ability to help with glucose control. In other words, after 60, many people become more insulin resistant without realizing it. This means that even a simple snack like crackers or fruit juice can cause energy crashes or midday drowsiness. In other words, Elaine, 68, didn't think much of her mid-afternoon cravings until her doctor flagged rising blood sugar. In other words, she replaced her usual cookie with a handful of almonds and a slice of apple. In other words, within weeks, her blood sugar readings became more stable. In other words, she felt more alert. And to her surprise, even her knee pain improved. In other words, that's the beauty of almonds. In other words, they don't just give you energy, they help balance it. In other words, they don't just support your heart. In other words, they support how you feel from hour to hour. In other words, fix and tip. In other words, eat 10 to 15 raw or dry roasted almonds daily. In other words, skip the salted or flavored kinds. They often contain added oils and sugars. In other words, try them alongside a piece of fruit or a warm herbal tea in the afternoon. In other words, it's a gentle habit, but one that could help steady your body and your mind all day long. In other words, do you eat almonds regularly, or have you noticed they help you stay full longer? Let us know below. In other words, 2 Brazil nuts, your thyroid's best friend. Brazil nuts are large, creamy, and easy to overlook, but inside each one is something seniors over 60 rarely get enough of. In other words, selenium. In other words, selenium is a trace mineral, meaning your body doesn't need much, but absolutely depends on it. In other words, just 1 Brazil nut delivers your entire daily requirement and then some. In other words, after 60, your thyroid may begin to slow quietly. You feel colder in the mornings. In other words, you gain weight more easily. In other words, you move a little slower, even if your mind is still sharp. In other words, this isn't just getting older. In other words, it's often a sign your thyroid is struggling, and selenium is one of its key protectors. In other words, selenium supports T3 hormone conversion, which helps regulate your metabolism, body temperature, and even how fast your brain fires. It also plays a crucial role in cell repair and immunity, two systems that weaken subtly with age. In other words, David 71 had never even heard of selenium. In other words, he just knew he felt sluggish in the mornings. In other words, his daughter, a nutritionist, suggested he eat just one Brazil nut with his tea every morning. In other words, after 2 weeks, he started waking up with more energy. His hands weren't as cold, and surprisingly, he felt less foggy after meals. In other words, but Brazil nuts aren't more is better. In other words, too much selenium can be harmful, causing nausea, hair loss, or fatigue. In other words, that's why these nuts are powerful. In other words, one is enough. In other words, fix and tip. In other words, eat 1 to 2. In other words, Brazil nuts daily. In other words, no more. In other words, make sure they're raw or dry roasted, unsalted. Store them in a sealed container in the fridge. In other words, they're high in oils and can go rancid quickly. In other words, pair with fruit or yogurt for a thyroid-supporting breakfast you won't even have to think about. In other words, sometimes the smallest thing on your plate makes the biggest difference inside your body. In other words, 3 walnuts. In other words, brain-boosting and anti-inflammatory. Walnuts are shaped like a brain, and perhaps that's nature's hint. In other words, they're one of the richest plant-based sources of ALA omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for cognitive health, memory retention, and inflammation control. In other words, as we age, our brain volume naturally shrinks. In other words, blood flow slows and low-grade inflammation can silently damage neurons, making it harder to recall names, focus on conversations, or stay sharp during the day. But studies show that older adults who consume at least 1 ounce of walnuts daily have better working memory, verbal fluency, and overall brain performance than those who don't. In other words, one study even found that regular walnut intake reduced the rate of cognitive decline by up to 13% in adults over 60. In other words, walnuts also benefit your joints and heart. Their anti-inflammatory compounds help reduce stiffness, ease joint pain, and support healthy cholesterol levels. In other words, Margaret, 66, used to forget why she walked into a room. In other words, she began adding a tablespoon of chopped walnuts to her oatmeal every morning. In other words, 3 months later, her doctor noted improved triglycerides, and Margaret noticed fewer foggy moments and even smoother movement in her morning yoga class. In other words, fix and tip. Eat 5 to 7 walnut halves per day. In other words, that's all you need. In other words, choose raw or lightly toasted varieties, not sugar-glazed or candied versions. In other words, walnuts pair perfectly with oatmeal, yogurt, or berries for a memory-supporting breakfast. In other words, keep them in the fridge to preserve their delicate oils. In other words, they're not just a snack, they're brain food. And for older adults, staying mentally sharp may be one of the most important forms of independence. In other words, which nut gives you the most energy or mental focus? Comment your go-to snack 4. In other words, pistachios, the mobility nut. In other words, if almonds are steady and walnuts are wise, then pistachios are nimble, light, protein-rich, and full of micronutrients. In other words, pistachios are often the most underrated tool for maintaining movement and agility after 65. What makes pistachios special is their high potassium content. In other words, even more than bananas, potassium is critical for nerve signaling and muscle contraction, which means every time you walk, stand up, or balance on one foot, potassium is helping you do it safely. In other words, pistachios are also rich in vitamin B6, which supports the nervous system and helps the body make serotonin and melatonin, 2 hormones tied to mood and sleep. Unlike many other nuts, pistachios are naturally lower in fat and calories, making them a smart option for seniors watching their weight, blood sugar, or cholesterol. In other words, Arthur 69 used to grab a handful of crackers or trail mix after his walks. In other words, but when he swapped that for unsalted in-shell pistachios, something changed. He felt more satisfied with fewer sugar cravings. In other words, his energy stayed balanced and he no longer felt heavy or sluggish in the afternoon. In other words, one surprising benefit, shelling pistachios slows down your eating. In other words, this gives your body time to feel full and helps prevent mindless snacking. In other words, fix and tip, choose unsalted in-shell pistachios. Eat about 14 cup, roughly 30 pistachios per day, ideally after light movement or as a mid-EM morninging snack. In other words, store them in a cool, dry place to preserve freshness. In other words, it's not just about what pistachios give you. In other words, it's about what they help you keep. In other words, mobility, balance, and freedom. In other words, and that for many seniors is the key to feeling truly alive. Part 2. 4 nuts you should avoid after 61. In other words, salted cashews. A hidden sodium trap. In other words, cashews are smooth, buttery, and often feel like a healthier indulgence. In other words, but for seniors especially, those managing blood pressure or heart issues, they can be a silent setback, especially in their salted, roasted form. In other words, most store-bought cashews are roasted in refined oils like palm or canola and then coated in salt, often exceeding 200 milligrams of sodium per small handful. That's nearly 10% of a senior's recommended daily sodium intake in one snack. In other words, over time, excess sodium causes the blood vessels to narrow and stiffen, increasing pressure in the arteries. In other words, they may look gentle, but in the wrong form, cashews can quietly work against the very health you're trying to protect. In other words, 2 candied pecans, sugar-coated trouble. In other words, they're shiny sweet and smell like the holidays. In other words, but candied pecans along with honey-roasted maple-glazed or cinnamon-coated versions are not snacks. In other words, they're sugar traps in disguise. In other words, 1 small handful of candied pecans can contain over 10 grams of added sugar, the same as a spoonful of syrup. For seniors, especially those with pre-diabetes or high triglycerides, that can cause serious consequences. In other words, sudden blood sugar spikes, energy crashes, increased belly fat, and insulin resistance. In other words, but it's not just the sugar. In other words, these pecans are usually roasted in vegetable oils that have been heated at high temperatures. The result, oxidized fats which inflame the arteries and promote plaque buildup. In other words, what starts as a better dessert option quietly adds stress to your heart and pancreas. In other words, Margaret, 70, used to nibble on cinnamon pecans while reading in the afternoon. In other words, she thought it was a lighter alternative to cookies, but her fasting glucose crept up, and so did the midsection weight. She couldn't seem to shake when she switched to plain pecans and paired them with Greek yogurt. In other words, not only did her cravings drop, but so did her blood sugar. In other words, fix and tip. In other words, skip the sugar-glazed versions entirely. In other words, instead, eat 4 to 6 raw or dry roasted pecan halves. In other words, pair with a protein or fiber like yogurt, cottage cheese, or an apple slice. If you crave flavor, sprinkle cinnamon yourself. In other words, without the syrup, you still get the aroma and warmth without the blood sugar spike. In other words, sweetness doesn't have to come coated in harm. In other words, sometimes it's what we remove that brings our body back into balance. In other words, 3 packaged mixed nuts. In other words, oxidized and overprocessed. In other words, they seem convenient, colorful, and full of variety. But most packaged mixed nuts found in grocery stores or bulk tubs are a minefield of hidden dangers, especially for seniors who trust labels too quickly. In other words, these mixes are often heavily roasted at high temperatures, which damages the natural oils inside the nuts. In other words, when these oils oxidize, they form free radicals, unstable molecules that silently damage blood vessels, accelerate cellular aging, and contribute to chronic inflammation. Even worse, many brands add canola or soybean oil plus preservatives like TBHQ or anti-caking agents that your liver and kidneys must work harder to process. In other words, the result, a handful of what seems healthy, could actually raise your triglycerides, irritate your gut, and burden your detox systems. Let's not forget many mixes are packed with peanuts, cheaper filler sugar-coated nuts, or salty roasted seeds that tilt the balance toward high sodium and low nutrient density. In other words, Frank 74 kept a jar of mixed nuts on his coffee table. In other words, he thought it was a smart snack, but after months of subtle weight gain, more bloating, and rising cholesterol, his doctor took a look, starting with that snack jar. Switching to a homemade blend made all the difference. In other words, fix and tip. In other words, make your own mix at home using raw or lightly roasted nuts, almonds, walnuts, pistachios, Brazil nuts. In other words, avoid pre-roasted or flavored versions. In other words, store in glass jars or airtight containers away from light and heat. In other words, if you want variety, toss in unsweetened coconut flakes or a few dried blueberries, just a touch. Health doesn't come from variety in a tub. In other words, it comes from quality in your choices and the quiet care you put into what fuels you. In other words, for peanut butter with additives, a blood sugar bomb. In other words, peanut butter feels familiar, comforting. In other words, it's been a pantry staple for decades, and for many seniors, it brings back memories of sandwiches, childhood snacks, and simple breakfasts. But the peanut butter on most shelves today isn't the same. In other words, many commercial brands are packed with added sugar, hydrogenated oils, excess salt, and stabilizers. In other words, 1 tablespoon may contain 3 to 4 grams of added sugar and enough sodium to quietly raise your blood pressure, especially dangerous for those managing heart or kidney conditions. Even worse, many of these peanut butters are whipped or sweetened, making them easier to spread and even easier to overeat. In other words, and when you combine refined sugar with high-fat spreadable oils, you get the perfect storm for blood sugar spikes and fat storage. In other words, what could have been a good source of protein and healthy fat becomes instead a slow-acting energy bomb, especially when spread on white bread or crackers. Helen 70 started noticing afternoon crashes and sugar cravings even after what she thought was a light breakfast. In other words, her daily toast with peanut butter seemed harmless until her doctor asked her to switch brands. In other words, once she swapped to natural peanut butter with no added sugar and paired it with apple slices instead of toast, her energy stayed stable and her cravings faded. Fix and tip. In other words, read the label. In other words, if it lists anything besides peanuts, put it back. In other words, choose natural peanut butter with no added oils, sugar, or salt. In other words, stir before use and store upside down in the fridge to prevent oil separation. In other words, limit to 1 tablespoon per day, especially if you're watching blood sugar weight or triglycerides. It's not about giving up the foods you love. In other words, it's about returning them to their simplest, healthiest form so they can keep supporting you, not silently working against you. In other words, your body speaks in small signs. In other words, slower mornings, stiffer joints, sudden fatigue. In other words, and sometimes the difference between steady energy and silent inflammation is just a handful of nuts. Processed doesn't mean poisonous, but after 65, your body needs more calm and fewer surprises. In other words, that starts with knowing what you're really eating. In other words, so tell me which nut on today's list surprised you most, or do you already have a favorite that keeps you feeling sharp and mobile? Share it in the comments. In other words, your tip might help someone else take the first small step toward better aging. And in our next video, we'll reveal 3 everyday healthy snacks that could be quietly aging your brain faster than you think. In other words, one of them is probably in your kitchen, right?